Hello, welcome again to Chile Talk. I'm Neil Davidson with Pete Lee. We have very recently made a short video about the Constitution and about why it should be accepted. The main, almost the only reason being really that we could find was that it's time to move on from the current Constitution so that people will have something else to blame for their troubles. And now, Pete, I would like perhaps to turn over to you, and you could start giving us some of the reasons why this constitution is actually bad and should be rejected.
Yes, well, the case for rejecting it, there is a single issue reason to reject it, perhaps, which is that it's dreadful. Like it's objectively reasonably dreadful. One of the main defenders of the reject line at the moment, representing a group that calls itself the Amarillos, the Yellows, who are centrists, essentially, being called yellow, certainly in Chilean Spanish, is basically an insult. But
it is what we would understand too by yellow, right? Which is basically saying they're kind of wishy-washy cowards.
Yes, and they're neither chicha nor lemonade. They're somewhere in the middle, which was really famously the complaint against Eduardo Frei Montalva's government during the 1960s. The Christian Democrats, who were backed by, well, the church and the United States, and didn't deliver the kind of change that a lot of people wanted.
The Amarillos are objecting to the Constitution, and what's their argument here?
Well, I mean, Christian Vanken puts this reasonably nicely. He says it's not up to the standards of the country, which I think is quite affecting, the way that he says it. He obviously believes that the country can do institutionality well. A lot of people have historically thought that. And he thinks that there are Chilean standards. This hasn't lived up to it. It's been a bit of a circus, the process, and he thinks the final document isn't up to it. Personally, I think, well, maybe it is up to the standards of the country. You know, it probably does reflect sort of the average, what would happen if you put 155 average Chileans together. Probably is at that standard. What it's not up to is the really quite decent standard of Chilean law over the last couple of centuries, where due to certain conservative instincts and certain cynicism, they've managed to come up with one of the better, possibly the best renditions of Hispanic law available. Now, in terms of its readability, I mean, it's hard for a Chilean to read. If you're a literary person, you can enjoy it in the sense that you would enjoy with a kind of dystopian enthusiasm a Roberto Bolaño screed, for example. It's kind of reads a bit like a parody of a constitution, perhaps, an overlong parody of a constitution. But there are some.
I don't know if it's been translated yet. Perhaps we might at some point have to find a bit and translate it and stick it up just to to get a taste.
I'm sure it's been translated, but how well can you translate it? This is a task for an absolute expert such as yourself, Neil.
Or maybe it's a task for Google Translate, so you can get the full flavour of just. Or
Deeple. Deeple. Shout out to Deeple, is very, very good at translating.
I use it all the time.
Yes, there are some very strong reasons to reject this. One is it's probably not lending itself to international confidence in the Chilean economy. The one big thing that Chile needs is to grow and order its economy a little bit more in the hope of getting some more public monies to be able to do whatever sorts of social rights and so on many people would like to see. build trust in the society, essentially.
So your first point about the kind of legal quality of it is that it's kind of sloppily drafted, essentially. It's not so much to do with the substance.
It's a little loose. It's a little loose and repetitive. It has a kind of thread through it, but it's not completely balanced.
Got it. So what you're saying the first time in the last episode, which is that this thread is going to have to be painstakingly sought for later if it passes and found and sort of clarified by setting legal precedents, whatever, and writing into law.
Yes.
Okay, and then the actual substance then. So you say it'll be bad for investment. So what are the kind of provisions that investors won't like?
Well, I mean, theoretically, there's property rights protected in this, but there is certainly one very important exception. As far as I can tell, mining will be subject to some environmental controls, but I think they can reliably be expected to be sufficiently corrupt not to get in the way of shipping minerals out of the country when the country needs money. I'm not too worried about that one. The water rights, which is a very emotive issue for the Chileans at the moment, and Chile's certainly under a drought at the moment, a very long drought. That's right. Issue, but
it is emotive. You quite often see it said that Chile is the only country in the world that's privatized water provision, which is quite wrong, isn't it?
Yes. But Chile's the only country in the world that's done many things, and the first country in the world that's done many things, and usually it isn't. Usually it isn't in the particular things that are cited.
And so what does the Constitution say about that? So they're trying to recover water rights for the state, or more specifically for the government,
the general population, and yes, not as much I guess oligarchy of the water. Now, one of the points on that front has to do with agriculture and indeed food security, which is a big issue around the world at the moment and heading into the future. Chile's got very good at agriculture over the last 40 years or so. Chile now exports a lot of fruit, high value fruit and vegetables. It's a fertile country, at least in the parts of the central part, very volcanic, obviously. And really, for the first time in its history, Chile's reliably good at agriculture. There's a lot of investment and technology in the agriculture. Some of it seems a bit basic compared to, say, the Netherlands, but it's very productive. And part of the reason for that is this sort of concentration of the agriculture in big business and within big business sort of systems, and the productive use of the land, which was one of the big reasons why there was a lot of pressure in the middle of last century for agricultural reform. Landholders were not exploiting their land because they didn't have markets to feed, really. Now, Chile does have markets to feed, including in exports, and the water rights situation probably has something to do with the rapid improvement in agriculture, including winemaking, for example. A lot of people don't know, but really the massification and the globalization of Chilean winemaking is a thing of the 1980s. Chile certainly made wine before that, and some very good wine, but the massive expansion is really the last 40 years.
So this is slightly different from, so we're not talking now about the drinking water that people get in Santiago and who provides that. It's not the equivalent of like Thames water or whatever in Britain is big. We're talking about agricultural water supply. How does that work at the moment?
Well, yes, at the moment you can buy, it's a market.
And sell. It's a market, you buy and sell water rights. Yeah. And so it goes to the highest bidder and therefore, at least in theory, whoever will use the most efficiently is the capitalist theory, right? And it seems to be kind of working reasonably well. So what will the new constitution do to this?
Well, the right to water, but not necessarily with any obvious mechanism for implementing that. So it's a source of uncertainty as it stands. And
this is probably true of a lot of things in the Constitution. I think we've already said this, that they're not fully worked through.
Yes, I mean, a lot of principles that are quite popular, but are hard to think of mechanisms simply to deliver. Another one's regionalization. Chile is a very long country. It's got regions, and for that reason, it's been subject to a very forthright centralization throughout its history, particularly of the extremes of the country, which were more or less conquered end of the 19th century, start of the 20th century in the case of the South. And regionalization is prima facie fairly reasonable. We've got all these regions. Why not empower them more? The problem we've got with that is it sounds like a recipe for empowering regional mafias. Regional elites, if you like, will become more powerful.
Okay, so we're not really talking about mafias as such, but the kind of a common Latin American, I guess, and not just Latin American situation where local businessmen, local party bosses have a pretty free hand, more than they might do in sort of Europe, even or in America, United States.
Yes, and of course there's the fear of the caudillo, the local warlord, which Chile managed to overcome, in its first, what we call the first civil war in 1829.
Right, and these days not literally a warlord, but somebody with enormous powers, a kind of patronage.
Yes.
So you're saying that the reasons that the country was strongly centralized still operate, which was indeed to control these kind of people who made like these far-flung places out of sight of the capital into their kind of personal fiefs.
Well, I mean, it has been exceptional among Latin American countries in not suffering too heavily from that problem. Perhaps for that reason, it can afford a bit more regionalization. Probably it can. We have to see what the mechanisms for this are, but probably creating an upper house, particularly a sort of toothless upper house that dignifies these the possibilities, the local celebrities or whatever, which is one of the big problems with the Constitutional Convention, is not the best idea. I mean, the most extreme and in some ways divisive or emotive aspect of this is the idea of a further round of land rights for the original peoples. Now, the original peoples have
the whole regionalization thing ties in with the multinational thing, right? But that's only an issue really in that part of the South that's historically mainly Mapuche, and then on a much smaller scale in the north with the Aymara and other much smaller ethnicities.
And some of those might be able to make claims on mineral deposits. So that's always an exciting issue. Now, the indigenous peoples received lands in the 1980s under the military government, the Pinochet government. Pinochet ceded lands to the Mapuche on the proviso that they not sell them. Now, under the Constitution of 1980, that was contrary to the Constitution. You can't stop someone selling their things or their labor, for that matter.
So after this first kind of Mussolini-style impetus of the dictatorship of syndicalism or whatever, it then, of course, became this famously neoliberal, didn't it?
Yes.
And property rights, free markets became fundamental.
Yes. So as it turns out, in the 1990s, there was quite a bit of selling of indigenous lands, and that has caused some problems. So it remains to be seen how the Indigenous lands exactly will operate under the Constitution. To me, given the corporatist sort of urge that seems to be in this Constitution, it does remind me of another paradigm, sort of Calvinist underpinnings of the apartheid regime in South Africa with its Bantustans. The idea of these territories that run alongside the state, which is a bit of a worry, and we're not sure how fruitfully those territories will operate.
Yeah, and so this is something that's part of Chilean history, and it's obviously then given added potency by a current fashion, which is for identity politics, which does tend to create a kind of apartheid.
Yes, out of nothing in some ways. We'll certainly be writing it into law, but far and away, probably the best element of this sort of identitarian corporatism, if you like, is the treatment of what in the Constitution is described variously as sexogeneric dissidents and sexual dissidents. This is describing, I believe, simply people who are not heterosexual or heteronormative. So the idea of there being other ways of doing things. Now, in order to recognize them in the text, they are described as dissidents. So on the one hand, they're being protected by the law. On the other hand, they're being described as dissidents. And this is a classic case of the inadvertent irony that the Chileans excel at. It wouldn't be called irony in Chile because we only use irony to describe when they're deliberately doing it. When they're producing irony, we call it English humor. So they've produced this irony, or this humor inglés in this case. Now, this actually echoes one of the most interesting aspects of legal philosophy, which is the concept of the outlaw, which we have a precedent in Roman law, fairly obscure precedent in Roman law that was covered by the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben, I think end of the 80s, very popular 20 years ago in English anyway. The idea of the holy man, homo caesar. The holy man cannot be sacrificed. He can't be made holy, sacrificed, because he's already holy. That stands to reason. But he can be killed by anyone. He's outside the law in a holy state. And this seems to have a parallel to this idea of sexogeneric dissidents. Perhaps the other way around. He's inside the law because he's outside the law. And that's a very interesting feature that will probably be very stimulating for legal scholars around the world if it actually gets written into law.
Well, that's right, because it sounds very deep, but actually probably just arises from a kind of mental incoherence. So actually it might be ultimately impossible to pass, I suppose. I mean, pass as in impossible to break down and understand and analyze. Yes. Yeah.
So the sexogeneric dissidents will not be losing any specialness, even if they are fully accepted. They will remain exceptional, which is, I mean, it's charming in a way, and quite nice. Now, but this is perhaps part of a bigger issue, and that is that if in the Hispanic legal and constitutional tradition, this is a normative attempt to formulate what Chile should be, and its length at 499 articles would suggest that they've made a pretty good effort of putting lots of stuff in there. Well, then it doesn't do a very good job of explaining everything that Chile is. You know, a lot of perspectives are not reflected in the text, despite its length.
Yeah. I mean, possibly if one could sum up something that's wrong with it, is that just with the concepts used, even the language at a very granular level, it's so much of the moment. That's a lot of this stuff, language will be out of date next year, won't it? So this is actually an attempt, an unwitting attempt, to fix Chile in the state it was, you know, in May 2022, forever, something like that.
Yes, sort of using French thinking from 1972, you know.
But in a particularly 2022 way. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Which is, you know, it's interesting. I mean, perhaps the more problematic aspect of the mismatch between the sort of normative aspirations of it and the reality is that it's very hard to divine how the actual Chile that there is going to move in the direction of this formulation. It's probably not at all got any purchase on the way things are going to be. It's not so much inviting a sort of flight from the public or flight from the state. It's not, ironically, the Constitution is not engaging in the state. It's not describing what Chile is. It's describing something else. It's a worry. It's a farrago. It's a gallimaufry. It's a bit of a mess, but in pretty much exact parallel to the possible reason it can be passed, one of the good things about rejecting this mess is that will be immediately followed by a process of reform. There's a need to reform the Constitution that there is. So rejecting the proposal does not necessarily mean rejecting the prospect of reform, because reform is obligatory. 78% of people voted to have a constitutional convention to write a new constitution. The Constitutional Convention did a pretty bad job, but there is a very real need. Yeah, there's a very real need for a new approach, a new rewrite of how things are, which can be construed as another reason to reject it. You know, there is going to be a second chance beyond this.
Okay, well, we truly are in a hall of mirrors here. Thank you for all that piece. I was mainly a spectator here. You've read this thing with attention, which I confess I haven't, but I will try to engage more with it, and we will no doubt be coming back to this and looking at, again, at various different specific aspects of the new constitution being proposed. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us here at Chile Talk, and hope to see you next time.
Thank you.